the first talk is going to be about Rails and object-oriented design from the first Tom Stuart of the day. Big hand for Tom, everybody.
Okay, Murray's made some shrugging gestures. I think we're all good. That's a lot of people. That is about 180 people. Hello. Wow. Yeah. Okay, so I want to... There's a mouse cursor, that's no good. I want to talk about Rails and object-oriented design. And I think that sometimes Rails can lead you, maybe not intentionally, but it can lead you down a path to a not particularly well-designed application. So I want to talk about ways that you can try to avoid that. So I'll try and use the remote. Let's see what happens. Oh, it works. So I am Morsis. I am not the other Tom Stuart. He's up there. Say hi. Hi, Tom. So if you have any questions about this presentation, obviously you should send them to the other Tom Stuart. I have been doing sort of OO type development for about 4 years and Ruby and Rails development for 2 years. So if you voted for this talk on Vestibule expecting an expert to come and talk to you about OO design, sorry, it's like voting for the Lib Dems. You don't get to take it back. And I've got the mic for half an hour. So this is my recent experience. This is the last Rails application I worked on. You'll notice it's so awesome that the lines of code breaks the table formatting on rake stats. It was a disaster in many, many ways, and it caused me to do this every time I run the tests. Possibly. Oh, this was meant to be the best joke in the talk. Oh, there's no jokes left now. That was meant to be Darth Vader at the end of Revenge of the Sith going, no! Never mind. At any rate, you'll notice that there were at least 5 different test suites. There was a code to test ratio of 1 to 2.5, but all the test said was that the code existed. None of them actually said anything. It was a disaster. Anyway, working on this application, I had plenty of time to think about what goes wrong when you just go with the flow and don't apply decent object-oriented design to a large application. And so this presentation is essentially my collected thoughts, not really wisdom, but my thoughts about the ways that we can try to do things better. So just to start off, I'd like to say thanks to everyone that gave feedback and voted for the talk on Vestibule. I only put the talk proposal in, so I'd guarantee I got a ticket, and then you all voted for it, so now I have to give the talk. Thanks very much. But seriously, it was really good. I think the talk could have gone in one direction and been very ranty, and actually it's quite practical, and it's full of, it's full of examples of things that I think you can do to make your applications better, which probably wouldn't have happened if people hadn't told me that's what they wanted, so that was really cool. And before we go any further, I want to make a disclaimer, because I know there is at least one member of Rails Core in the audience. I love Rails. Rails is really cool. So this is not meant to be Rails bashing. It's meant to be use Rails, but be careful about how you use it, is essentially the message to take away from the talk. I'm not using the remote. I brought the remote along. So a thought experiment. Take the last Rails app you worked on. Think back to it. How easy would it be to take all of that business logic, everything that's in there, and put it into a GUI application, for example, or create a library that you could use some of that business logic in the next application? How coupled is it to the idea of a web application with a relational or NoSQL backend? I would imagine that there would at least be some work involved for most Rails applications. And I would suggest that the idea of object-oriented programming was meant to be, to a certain extent, reusability, but also just modularity and the ability to take things and use them elsewhere. So if we can't do that, then we've probably done something wrong along the way. If you do have a Rails app that you could do that, then this talk's probably not for you. Okay, so in my opinion, object-oriented design is all about writing our code so it's responsive to change, encapsulating the things that are going to differ in the future so that when we do have changes, it's not a nightmare where we have to change things all over the place, and so on and so forth. And there is obviously a large body of knowledge about this, and I don't want to talk down to you about this. So I'm just going to skim over some of the OO design principles that I think we could apply to Rails apps. So the solid design principles is essentially a bunch of long words for things that are pretty simple, self-explanatory, but I want to sort of bear them in mind as we look at some Rails code. So I've put on slogans, and you're probably all going to disagree with me about these definitions, but just very quickly. The single responsibility principle says that a class should have only one reason to change, i.e. It's only responsible for one thing in your system, and therefore you don't have to change it if anything else changes. The open-close principle says that your objects should be open for extension, but closed for modification, i.e. you should be able to change the behaviors of your systems and plug things into objects so that they can meet different or changing business needs without having to change their code, which is not as easy as it sounds. The Liskov substitution principle is so pompous. It's not even that interesting, but inheritance only if child is a parent. So you can only inherit from animal if your subclass is an animal. Interface segregation principle, I love this one. It's, why do we need such long words? It's just, don't make your objects too big. That's all it is. And dependency injection, objects don't get to choose their collaborators. So you should be able to pass in, if you have a dependency on something else, you should be able to have that passed in and work with it polymorphically. So, solid design principles, let's try and apply them to some Rails code. And I want to start with ActiveRecord, and all the things I think are wrong with ActiveRecord on my soapbox. So, ActiveRecord versus the single responsibility principle. And this is very unfair. I'm sorry, Rails core, it is unfair. But what I'm talking about here is a sort of typical ActiveRecord project, model in most of the projects I've worked on. So it's not really ActiveRecord itself. But the way you can tend to go is that an ActiveRecord model, a typical fat model, will need to change when something in your database changes, or you change your storage engine completely. Something will have to change in your model. Your business logic changes because you're putting in all those methods about, what users can do and all the rest of it. You want to present it differently because you put in methods in there like to.html or to.xml or to API version 3. I didn't put it in, but obviously the validation, which is partly business logic, if that changes, your model will need to change. So we're violating SRP to a certain extent with a lot of our fat models. The Liskov substitution principle, well, every ActiveRecord model has to inherit from ActiveRecord base, but what is an ActiveRecord base? Is post an ActiveRecord base? I don't know, could be. It's kind of a silly one, no one really cares. And that might actually be the takeaway from this talk, that no one actually cares, which is fine. ActiveRecord versus interface segregation principle, again, it's not ActiveRecord, but there's obviously, Jameis Buck came out 5 years ago and said, skinny controller, fat model, try and put all of your logic into the models. And that's fine until you've got more than one set of logic methods in there. And then you just end up with a God object that, if anything changes, that model needs to change. And I would imagine that's quite a common story across a lot of Rails projects these days. Okay, so, yeah, the other two, well, it's no different from anything else, really. Okay, so I'm going to stop ranting and look at some typical code using ActiveRecord, and I want to try and take it towards a more object-oriented design, applying solid principles. So here's some code from a controller. No one would write anything like this, right? No. So if you look down through this code, you'll notice that this controller and this method has a number of different responsibilities. Obviously, it's responsible for grabbing user input from the params. It's responsible for calling on various models. It's then responsible for dealing with the results of that and rendering something different based on what happened. So there's a number of responsibilities here, and it's all in a controller. So if you wanted to pull out your business logic objects and create a GUI application or something, you're pretty much out of luck because this is an action controller based, and yeah, You're not going to get anywhere. So clearly we want to push some of this down to the model layer. So you might take a first step of creating a close method in order, which encapsulates some of this logic, and then have the controller call on that. This is obviously now improving the encapsulation of the order model. We're no longer mutating it through the controller. We're allowing the order to have control of its own data. It means if any of the order closing logic changes, the controller doesn't need to know about it, which makes sense. But we still have a problem, which is, if you'll notice, the if method is card. Now, this is all pretty contrived, but the idea is you've got different payment methods on an order, and they're going to have different logic about them. Now, at the moment, if we say, OK, we want to accept payment by check or cash on delivery, all of that needs to go into order, but that's not to do with orders. So the order class has two responsibilities. It's responsible for its own data and persistence, but it's also responsible for handling payments. So that's a violation of SRP. We want to deal with that so that we can accept other payment methods in the future. So you might try to pull that away from the order model, and this is something we're going to see quite a lot of throughout, is the idea of creating a plain old Ruby object, not an active model, an ActiveRecord model, just something else that encapsulates some logic. So if we have the order process, then at least order doesn't have to change when your payment methods change. Order is still has that close method, which is responsible for mutating its own data, but the order process is encapsulating everything involved there. We've still got the problem of if the payment methods change, we're still going to need an else if. Else if is a smell. We can use polymorphism to get rid of that kind of thing. So the final step I would suggest is introducing a new model, which is not ActiveRecord based, called payment. You can then grab a sort of payment handling dependency and pass that into the order process so that you end up with the order process just calling off to the payment to handle that logic, which then means you can have card payment inheriting from this payment class. You can have cash payment, et cetera, et cetera. Put into that factory method. Ooh, sounds enterprisey. In that factory method, you can then return different objects based on what needs to be done with all of the logic implemented by the handle payment method for each payment. That means then you can deal with n payment methods without having to introduce else ifs and so on and so forth. Obviously here we do have an if, but you could just do a lookup instead from a hash. So this is not really Rails. It's not Rails at fault. It's essentially bad code at the beginning. But the problem is ActiveRecord makes all of its accesses public, and scaffolding code and a lot of the example code out there encourages you to mutate your ActiveRecord objects and then save them and do it all in the controller. And that's not good for ensuring encapsulation and going towards a good object-oriented design. So if we introduce business logic objects that the controller calls upon, we can begin to take away some of this spreading of concerns across an application. The payment order process and order are now all reusable. You can use them in a GUI application if you want. They've got no dependencies on the controller, which is essentially just setting up the objects and putting them to work. And then it has its responsibilities for rendering the result. OK. Still a lot of people. No one's walked out. Amazing. 180 people. I ran the numbers. 180 people means statistically 59.4 of you don't run your tests after you merge upstream code. Statistics, it's true. And 12 of you commit code that you've commented out. Absolutely appalling. Anyway, the view layer. I don't expect that anything in this next section will be surprising, but it's worth saying anyway. So the view layer. there tends to be a kind of progression in our code from putting logic directly in the view in our ERB or Haml or Markaby or whatever you're using templates, and then thinking, oh, that's not particularly reusable, it's certainly not readable, and pulling it out maybe to a helper, which is testable on its own. And then you think, well, it's a helper, but it's not an object, and it's kind of, I don't know. So you do the fat model thing, and you push it down to the model. And there it's reusable across the application. It's not just in your views. You could render XML with the same logic and so on and so forth, and it's all lovely. But then you think, oh, this model's massive, and I have to change it every time I want to make any change in my system. So what I want to suggest we do, if you're not doing it already, is move that logic into a presenter. So again, another very, very contrived code example with widgets. They're just things. And so this is obviously some more code that no one here would write. And it's no good. I mean, we could extract this to a partial, but essentially we've got logic here, which is A, not the view's responsibility, and B, not particularly reusable or testable. So it's smelly, even from a kind of structured programming point of view, not even getting into OO. So we might do something like this and create the worst helper ever written. I haven't written a helper in a bajillion years, so I'm sure there's a better way of doing this. But essentially, some kind of helper that spits out some view code. Because at least you can call that from more than one place, and at least you can write a unit test for it. But what's a helper? I mean, it's just a method that gets mixed in somewhere. It's not an object that responds and has state and does all of those nice things that we used to do. So you push it down to your model, and you have a DSales4, and you let the widget decide which data it shows, which is good. You know, this is nice, object-oriented, things in control of its own data. It's only got, well, it's got about 4 reasons to change now because it's an ActiveRecord model. But at least the logic around widgets is in the widget class. The issue, of course, is this is a mixing of concerns, because it is essentially, it's presentation logic. It's not really to do with widgets. It's about what we want to show to the user in different circumstances. So actually putting it into the model, I think, is a mistake. And so, again, why don't we just create a Ruby object? It's really easy to create objects in Ruby, so we should do it more. So we create a widget presenter. And this is essentially an implementation of the Decorator pattern, although I'm not showing all of the code here. But the best way to do it, I think, is to have a widget presenter that wraps a widget instance. It then passes on, essentially, you could do it via method missing or delegate or whatever you want, pass on all of the methods you're not interested in onto the original object and introduce logic around the more interesting stuff. So you could put your presentation logic around what you show in different circumstances into that details method, and therefore have this presenter only having the concern about what to display in different circumstances. The widget doesn't have that presentation logic mixed into it. The view can just call on an object. The advantage of wrapping this in a presenter, you can test it on its own. You can test it with a mock object if that's your bag, because it just takes a dependency in, that's dependency injection. You can make it look like a model. You don't actually have to change your view code, because it can delegate all its methods down to the model, the stuff you're not interested in. So if you apply Decorator like this, there's not actually a huge amount of change you need to make. It's only in the controller what you pass in to the view. And unlike an ActiveRecord model, it's in control of the access to its data. You're only going to be able to get data out if you've either said delegate or you'd find a method. ActiveRecord models have default accesses. So, and you've reduced the responsibilities of your model. I still think that ActiveRecord models generally violate SRP, but it's not too bad. At least you're not mixing in yet another concern. So that's that, the view layer. Now, it's not all bad. Rails, you know, you might think that I'm a raving Rails hater. That's not the case at all. I use Rails all the time. It's great. I get paid to work with Ruby, and that's because of Rails. So thanks, Rails. And essentially, this whole presentation is just a troll. It's got nothing to do with Rails. All it is if you are not watching out for what you're doing and if you're not writing object-oriented code, you're going to make a mess. And Rails just doesn't make it particularly easy to write object-oriented code, but then nothing else does. So it's not really about Rails. I've just hooked you in with the controversy. And in Rails 3, there's loads and loads of nice stuff, actually, to help you write more object-oriented code. One of which is custom validators. I think these are amazing. The concern about validation, you can actually now pull that out of your models. If you've got complicated validation rules, you can pull it out to a separate object and just use this validates with order validator. You can go and do this now and create a plain old Ruby object that just takes in, via its validate method, your record, and then it has access to the errors hash. You can put all of your logic around validation in there and reduce the amount of responsibility as your order has. You can go and do this now, and you should. So that's pretty cool. That's in Rails 3. There are also custom responders. I stole this code shamelessly from the Ruby on Rails blog because I've never used a custom responder. Essentially, if you have a lot of logic around your responses in your application, then you can pull that out again to a separate object, reducing the amount of things your controller has to do. And this one, it does have to inherit from action controller responder, but it's pretty good from an OO point of view. It's only got the one responsibility. It calls on the controller as an object. I don't know how it ends up there. It's a bit of magic. But it's pretty cool. This code, I believe, is doing some caching stuff with the fresh when method, which was new on me. But it's quite nice for pulling out that concern from an already fairly bloated controller. So I'm sure there's loads of other stuff post Rails 3 that I haven't really looked into very much. My last application was Rails 2.3, so I'm kind of behind the curve. But I'm sure there's loads and loads of stuff, and I do think Rails is moving in the right direction. There's loads of cool toys that you can use. So yeah, that was my little segment of the talk where I tried to persuade Rails core not to have me lynched. So that is essentially all I have to say. So Rails does love you. I mean, Rails will allow you from a standing start very quickly to get Model 2 architecture with persistence, objects, model view controller. It will allow you to get to the 80% of the uninteresting CRUD so that you can get on with your business logic. But it doesn't take you any further. And it doesn't have anything in there that leads you down the next part, which is isolating your business logic into plain objects. So Rails hates you as well. You've got to be careful. Ruby, on the other hand, loves you. There is no language out there that I know of that makes creating new objects that respond just to whatever. You don't have to create interfaces, anything like that. There's nothing else out there that's quite so simple in terms of introducing objects that solve problems. It's so low ceremony, and we ought to do more of it. But in order to do that, you have to go off the Rails a bit. Rails only gives you the app models, app views, app controllers. You have to be willing to create something else that isn't one of those. So here is the best thing you could do all day. If you did disobey the instructions and bring your laptop, go and do this right now. Stick some stuff in your config application RB. This is Rails 3. If you're not on Rails 3, don't know. But you can have other folders apart from lib and app models, app views, app controllers on your load path. You should do it because if you're going to be creating lots of objects, you're going to want somewhere to put them. So go ahead and do this. It's well worth it. OK, so that was me. Pass on your questions to the other Tom. No. Yeah, do it. Because I really don't know what I'm talking about. These slides are up at that address. I've also put it on lanyard. And if you go to that address, the very last slide is some links to further reading. Essentially, all the places I stole this from. I want to point out the Draper gem is an implementation of Decorator presenter pattern so that you don't have to write quite so much code. And also, you should check out the Cookie Monster singing Tom Waits. That's just a little gift from me to you. It's exceptional. Nothing to do with OO, probably. So that was that. Do that. We've got a little bit of time.
Yeah, that should pick up your voice. So.
Okay.
If you have a question, stand up, make yourself known, whatever, and I'll come to you with mine.
Can you show the example view slide view?
Have I got a syntax error or something?
Actually, it's not question to you. To be honest, I prefer Discord to the one you wrapped up. So everyone, how do you think? You prefer logic is all logic is there, or you want to hide the logic? Like it's not wrap the logic into class. Anyone prefers this logic? Logic is in view.
I did.
Yeah, I prefer it.
It's much
clearer.
Sorry.
It's a very simple example.
One of these case? Yes.
Yeah, this case.
I think it depends on how many people working on the project. If you've got a lot of people working on the project, you want to hide that logic. If you provide yourself, then probably fine.
Yeah, so my point is I often meet code which the logic is hide behind the view, or lot of you have to dig into a lot of classes to find the logic. So sometimes I experiment, and then when part I like Rails is more straightforward when you write code. So
I think that's.
Write RDocs for your.
I think that's a very fair point, though, which is if you take this to its logical extreme and you apply all of these rules religiously, then you are going to end up with loads of objects, and you are going to have to dig around all over the place to find where the logic is. So in this example, you probably wouldn't bother. I mean, there's hardly any logic there, but I'm trying to write code that fits on slides. If you have a lot of logic in a view and you want to reuse it, then it's probably going to be easier to move it somewhere else. But I don't think these are hard and fast rules. The whole thing's a troll. I've only got half an hour. Yeah.
I just wonder, anything under Rails 3 is automatically added to it.
Okay. Awesome. There you go. All the way up there.
Make it run like Annika Rice.
I often wonder if, sticking to these beautiful principles of object-oriented design, whether it's a bit like just getting in the way of seeing that Rails has already putting a lot of emphasis on trying to separate different types of logic. So if you're already thinking about helpers and separation of these control aspects, for example, into separate mixing modules, there's already an effort to give you at least a handle of where to change things. And I wonder whether it's really, what's your view on it, or whether to really think that if you put it in a different object and do call-outs with method mixing to the original object, whether it's really, is it really a much better technique than just using a module mixing, which is very clearly defined where it is and what its responsibilities are, and instead of method mixing, you just call the method, and since it's mixing, it will use your.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not particularly attached to method mixing. I think mix-ins are great for where they're used, but if you do want to separate out responsibilities, adding in another mix-in to a model is essentially just giving it more methods, which may or may not be the best thing to do. I think all of this depends on the size of your application. I'm coming from the point of view of that monster application from the preamble. If you're on a Rails app with 5,000 lines of code, you probably don't need to worry about any of this at all. But if you've got a huge object model where changes are a pain, then applying some of this stuff makes them less painful.
Any more?
This isn't a question. I just wanted to point out what you were saying with the validators.
Mm-hmm.
You can also do that with callbacks. You can push that off to a a separate class, which I only found out
Yeah.
last week, and I quite like it.
So you do that with lambdas? And then,
No, not even a lambda, you just...
oh yeah, of course, it's just a method.
Destroy, you can give it a class name, and it'll call a class method, or you can give it an instance of the class and it'll call an instance method.
Cool.
That's the only response to call.
Organise them from top to bottom, back to right.
Just want to make a point in favour of what Tony was talking about. If you actually extract your business logic out into your plain Ruby objects, then it'll be easier for you to test, and the test will run faster because you never have to load the Rails environment. So it's just another way of running your fast specs,
Yeah.
move your business logic into plain Ruby objects. Someone over there, go make it up.
Anything else on track, anyone?
This looks great from down here.
You say like, oh, this is the greatest gift that you give yourself is to add those things to the code plan. How much do you think is like psychological? Like, there's a whole thing about, you know, if you don't follow the Rails way, you will genuinely find yourself like in a quagmire. So, you know, what could Rails do, for example, to kind of enable this? Would it just be simply having that folder? Would that be enough? Because very much, if it's not a model, a view, a controller, or helper, yeah, I'm kind of going off. Yeah, like you say, the derailing is it's quite. I think, yeah, as you go and you're learning about something, you know the solid principles. You're already probably gonna. It's not very far for you to make that leap. But I think as a beginner, I think it's quite scary to think, well, I'll just create my own folder here. It's already do so much.
I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of this is about psychology. It's not about Rails. I don't think there is anything that Rails ought to do differently, particularly. I find that when I develop in Rails, there's just seems to be more resistance, even though I know I should, to creating plain old Ruby objects compared to developing something in Sinatra or a gem or whatever it is. And I'm not really sure on the reasons for that. I don't actually think that Rails should change very much.
Anyone else? Really? No? Okay, right. I'm neutral.
Yeah, I don't really have a question.
No.
I think part of it as well is down to possibly the development environment that we work in Rails. Like most of them, we use something like TextMate, where it doesn't help you have lots of classes. You know, when you're developing a Rails app, knowing that there's those 3 folders that you're generally going to jump between makes it a lot easier. Whereas if you've got hundreds of classes across different folders, there's that extra effort. Whereas maybe other languages or other environments make it a bit easier with a better dev environment.
I'll just do a plug for Vim. Vim and C tags makes that a non-issue because you can just jump to a method definition. C tags, use C tags.
So I think part of the problem is that Rails tries to make things really easy for newbies, and the things that are easy for newbies aren't necessarily great object-oriented design, but I think this is something that a lot of people are becoming aware of, and it's something that should change in not just in what Rails gives you out of the book, but out of the box, but also the books and literature that's available and guides and stuff like that. So, but there is that fine line to tread, I think.
The official Rails core rebuttal.